very much. In opening opposition, we have McGill A. Next, on closing government, we have Sofia A. Awesome. And last but not least, we have University of Sydney B. Please keep the chatter to the minimum. If you like the point, please don't clap. It's a super bad. If you don't hear anything, you will ruin the speech. So don't do that. Do whatever, change something with the hands if you want. And that's it. And please don't judge. There's people literally behind us, and they know how hard it is to judge people enough. Please don't do that. And then that's it. So best of luck to all teams, and I'd like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister.
Does it work if I speak at this volume?
Yeah, by the way, this is streamed. If you don't want to consent, just say it before you speak, please. Thank you.
When the historians of the future write the story of our time, COVID-19 lockdowns will be the rot at the core. They caused harms so vast and myriad, it is impossible to conceptualize how much brighter our planet would have been had we not been subject to them. I will first explain the educational harms, then the economic harms, then the harms to our politics and society. On setup, there are three things I want to know. The first is we regret the set of countries that adopted this policy. Obviously, some set of countries were not able to adopt harsh lockdowns or harsh other interventions. We are not regretting those circumstances. Second, the most likely counterfactual, we think, is the Swedish model. What was that model looking like? First, it was strong state provision of medical advice. It told you to use masks. It told you to get vaccinated. It told you to do things, but it never mandated them. Second, it was a facilitation of work from home. The state will pass legislation to aid work from home. They might provide funds available to subsidize companies to make it easier to work from home, but they will never mandate that it work from home. Third, it is of course a massive investment in vaccines. I think Operation Warp Speed will occur on both sides of this debate. Fourth, it is short and sharp lockdowns, perhaps once or twice to slow the spread, so 2-week-long lockdowns at most, but never anything that is likely to last a little long term, as occurred in most Western states. Finally, it is the provision of services for elderly or the immunocompromised. Those people, factually in Sweden, were allowed to stay at home, were given state subsidies to do things like access delivery services or online services that brought things home. That will continue to occur. Why is that likely? One, it's the empirical alternative. Those developed states that had capacity to pursue these lockdowns but did not pursued this. That is what Sweden did. Second, it requires less resources than the counterfactual. This is the cheaper and easier option. You do not need to mandate vaccines. You simply put investment into them and encourage them. And third, it is what lobbies of importing groups want. The elderly lobby will continue to lobby, and that of course they're politically influential in many states because they tend to be old, they tend to be voting, they tend to be politically engaged. They will continue to push for things like services. People like the pharmaceutical lobbies will continue to push for investment into vaccines. That will occur. Happy to take the clarification if we got one. First argument. Educational harms. The context of school closures is just, I think, something we have externalized from our mind. For all of 2020 and 2021, the majority of states did not have children attending school in person. For some time, they were not attending school at all. For the majority of that time, they were attending school online. The counterfactual is perhaps immediately for 2 weeks, you might have those shutdowns, but for the vast majority of the time, we think schools will be back in person. Perhaps that requires the creation of air purifiers where they can be afforded, or the opening of windows and doors where it cannot, but school will be in person. What were the harms of school closures? First, an enormous learning loss, and this is empirical reality. Enough time has passed since COVID that we can observe that PISA scores dropped for those who were learning online, and they have not recovered. Why? One, teachers could not supervise. They could not see what students were doing, and parents who were busy, who were working, who were stressed, did just not have the ability to compensate for it. So students could do whatever they wanted, which is how educational gaps have begun to grow in our society. High achievement students that would put in the effort anyway, they succeeded, but the vast majority were were left behind. Second, there is way more distractions when you're learning school online. I spent the vast majority of online school playing Trackmania on my laptop. I cannot remember anything I learned in my economics class, but I can remember intricately the details of those tracks. Third, the vast majority of states, unfortunately, did not require people to do tests. That is, the UK and US especially did not require the provision of A-levels or SATs. They were in most circumstances optional to apply to university. People, generally speaking, didn't do them because they didn't see any need. That meant that people lost learning. But secondly, they lost socialization. And the reason is that they just weren't interacting with people a lot. And I think this manifests in a lot of different harms. For very young children, a very, very significant harm is that because they spent most of 2 years not seeing anyone in person, and then another year seeing everyone in masks, they actually can't read facial expressions, and that is a harm that has been shown to last into the long term. Children born at around that time are much worse at understanding other people's intents. But secondly, children just spent far more than they should on their own. Not enough time was spent playing with friends or family. Far too much time was spent on Discord and Hoi4. But thirdly, the harms of all of that I've described may seem small, because it just applied to kids who were at school then. But firstly, every child at any stage of the educational system, those are formative years. When you're very young, they're formative years for your identity. When you're at the end of your schooling career, it is the formative years for what career you go into. And the evidence is that those mistakes have not been made up for. There is a permanent 2-year educational gap affecting about 20 years worth of children that will continue into the workforce. Before I move on, closing. Opening.
Okay, we're gonna have masks for much longer, even in the best case for your world. If the biggest harm you're proving is a loss of capacity to read social cues, then I don't really know how you're solving that.
For young children, I'm assuming they would have at least some amount of time where they are in person, seeing other children, engaging with masks off. For instance, if they're outside, I think the harm is, of course, that they're online. Secondly, economic harms. They were disastrous. There are 3 costs on the economy directly, and of course, the stimulus stuff. First, an economic cost on the economy was a bunch of businesses closed down because of lockdowns. Things like service sectors, things like restaurants, all these employees were sent home without pay, fired in most jurisdictions. Second, the inefficiencies of work from home were so myriad to the economy. It meant that it was impossible for businesses to determine how most workers were spending their time. And it was only really towards the very, very end of the pandemic period that even somewhat amounts of efficiencies for creating that, things like more efficient tracking software was developed, because that technology takes time. So for most of the time, people were just working less and less productively. And of course, in some circumstances on our side, there will be work from home. But it is where companies want it and the state is providing assistance to do it. But if a company finds that work from home is not working, that its employees are unproductive, the goods and services are not being given to ordinary people in the way they need it, that company will go back in person. Finally, there were supply shocks, the massive shutdown of borders, the massive inability to purchase goods, the harms to people's livelihoods because they were no longer buying things, the loss of jobs, meant the supply sectors crashed in ways that are unimaginably dangerous. Even in countries which did not experience lockdowns, the spikes in price of food that occurred over this period led to famines in Egypt, it led to riots in Nigeria. Finally, the response of the state to all these problems was stimulus. Stimulus like you wouldn't believe, stimulus like you've never heard of before. So much money went into the American economy, and that overheated the economy. It led to inflation, which one, can be directly causatively related to the win of Donald Trump as election. But second, it led to the wiping out of people's savings. Ordinary pensioners lost their livelihoods, lost all they had saved for in the inflation. But thirdly, led to barriers to investment, barriers to continued engagement in the economy, continued forms of uncertainty. Finally, social political harms, 3 of them. Firstly, tragically, an enormous number of people suffered mental health crises or died during this period because they just didn't talk to people. They just didn't see family or friends, especially those who lived at home, especially those who were vulnerable, were not able to go see each other, and that is a harm that is tragic. But second, it led to a massive discrediting of the elite class. One, because all of these lockdowns seemed unnecessary. Australia, everyone was super proud of the lockdown we had because it stopped things, but then, once we opened up, all of the COVID deaths happened everywhere. Anyway, everyone looked at Sweden and said they had 2 much better years, they are now far better off, why didn't you do that? Secondly, because of scandals, things like Partygate in the UK alienated people. But third, it led to massive political polarization. 1, because of all of the forms of government overreach that people perceived in their lives. But 2, because people just got weird. They just spent too much time in line, too much time without friends, too much time without family. It ruined their school, ruined their economy, ruined their lives. We would all be so much better if we hadn't had it.
The leader of the opposition!
right, is everyone ready? Perfect. 3, 2, 1. The Prime Minister gives his speech as if the interventions that occurred in the world in response to COVID were not because of a disease that killed millions of people. Simple case for you today. Why these interventions were done well, why these interventions were effective, and why state intervention was necessary to save lives. But first, a few responses to opening government. Their counterfactual is really nice. I wish we lived in a world where people had as high of trust in government as they do in Sweden. Unfortunately, this is not the case, because in the United States, people were taking ivermectin because they thought that it would be effective to stop COVID. Because in most places in the world, people do not trust their government as much as they trust the Swedish government. They don't have the same knowledge of how disease spreads like they do in Sweden. A lot of people are undereducated, a lot of people do not trust their government. The Swedish model, which relies on a lot of public trust and a lot of public information, simply is not feasible in most places in the world. But also it requires a high degree of government capacity, which is not possible in most places. Then they tell you about education and social and political backlash. First on education. The harms of this were not great, but a lot of them are reversible. The remarkable thing about children is that they can learn as they get older. And I think weighing is really important here, because COVID kills people, it kills children, but even if children are less perceptible to this disease, it'll kill their parents, it'll kill their grandparents. I think that is probably quite bad for the development of these children, probably worse than just not being able to read facial expressions. And they talk about social and political backlash. You know what also causes social and political backlash? When millions of people are dying and they perceive their government as doing nothing to stop the spread of the very thing that is killing them. I think you probably get worse backlash on their side of the house. Why then are governments able to do this well? Why was intervention rolled out effectively in most places? The first thing to note is that intervention is quite costly for government. It's costly for governments to slow down their economy. It's costly for them to implement a lot of these different types of interventions. This means that they only did it to the capacity that they believed it was necessary. There were not many circumstances where interventions were too extreme, because interventions that were too extreme were extremely costly for government. They had to do the cost-benefit analysis. This means that in most places, these interventions were effective in the capacity that they were done. But also, in places where there was low capacity for intervention, there is international support that is able to make sure that these sorts of interventions were effective, like the World Health Organization helping developing countries implement these sorts of things as well. And finally, there's a lot of positive spillovers from the stronger effects in richer nations that benefit poorer nations. I don't think it's fair for opening government to say that the same incentive to develop vaccines, for example, is symmetric on both sides of the house. When you have more drastic interventions in the economy, for example, as a result of COVID, you increase the benefit of having a resolution to this thing that is slowing down your economy. You increase the incentive to develop a vaccine that is going to get people back to work. This means that you're going to get more funding for vaccines, both publicly because the public sector wants to lift restrictions, and they can only do this if people are less immunocompromised to COVID-19, but also increases the potential benefits that private investors get from stopping this terrible disease that is shutting down the economy. And notably, that once a vaccine is developed, it benefits everyone. This is incredibly good. These spillover effects are very positive. Why then are interventions effective in all of these circumstances? The first thing that interventions do is they slow the spread of the disease. This is incredibly important for a lot of reasons. They're able to slow the spread of the disease because when you have physical distancing, when you have a vaccine mandate, when you have mandatory testing and contact tracing so you know exactly who's being exposed and how they're being exposed, you're able to isolate individuals that are ill. You're able to provide them with the health care that they need. The importance of slowing the spread, even if you do not 100% stop people from getting COVID-19, is because you are able to actually have the healthcare system provide healthcare to people that need it the most, that are ill from the disease. If you don't have any strong state interventions, everyone is going to get sick at the same time because the disease is going to spread much more quicker. Even if the number of people getting COVID-19 is symmetric on both sides of the house, we have it better because in the status quo, most healthcare systems are incredibly underfunded, so they do not have the capacity to provide healthcare to everyone. But even if they are incredibly well-funded, you don't have hospitals that are able to hospitalize every single person in an entire city because healthcare systems simply are not built up for these sorts of disaster or crisis responses. Closing.
Ask Matt Cato about how well the vaccine worked for him. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, I don't think I can do that right now, but I'm sure it was probably fine. Okay. The second reason why interventions are effective is because they protect the most vulnerable and the people that depend on the most vulnerable. Because you're slowing the spread, these people are less likely to get to the disease, but also through drastic interventions, you have the provision of accommodations to people that necessarily have to isolate themselves for a variety of reasons. You have stimulus checks going to people that have to remove themselves from the workforce because they cannot expose themselves to the same sorts of risks. You have workplace accommodations for people that are immunocompromised or people that don't want to expose themselves to the disease, or perhaps live with their grandparents that might be more vulnerable to these sorts of things. You have more protective measures being mandated. And if you do have to work on the front lines, at least you know that your employer is going to care for you, even if those provisions are going to be costly. You have things like rent freezes, which allow people that are struggling under COVID-19, if their industry is affected specifically by the disease, to weather it more effectively. Why then is state intervention necessary? Why does their model simply not work? The first reason is that private incentives often come before health in a lot of cases. This is because people's bosses are typically not on the ground with them. If you own a restaurant, you're not actually running food every single day. You're not exposed to all the people that your employees are exposed to, so you're not as proximate to the risk that your employees are exposed to. You care more about your profit than you care about your employees in a lot of circumstances. But also there's a lot of competitive pressure. If you don't have the government shutting down every restaurant, for example, you don't want to be the first one to shut down because that gives your competitors an advantage to capture the market. So because of this competitive pressure, even if you do care about your employees, everyone is going to lose their jobs if you don't pressure them to continue to work. So even if you care about them, you have to pressure them to continue to work. But also there's a collective action problem. People believe that they are the individual exception. Of course, I'm not going to get COVID. Of course, I'm not going to get sick because I'm a special boy and Jesus loves me. But also, there's very high costs to deviate. So if you're the only one in the workforce that's stepping back because you cannot expose yourself to this disease, then someone else is simply going to take your place, and there is no provisions to help you. But finally, people are just very, very bad at risk analysis. This is why people gamble and they still lose a fuck ton of money. They just don't understand the probabilities, they don't understand the consequences. A lot of the symptoms of COVID-19 overlap with other sorts of diseases. So you might think that you have COVID, but you sort of don't want to test yourself because if you do, then you might have to recuse yourself from your workplace. You're just gonna say, I have a cold and I'm probably fine, and they're not gonna test yourself and you're gonna expose other people to this disease, spreading death. And people have an optimism bias. They tend to believe that everything is going to be okay, that everything is going to be fine, and this means that they take more risks than they ought to. What have I proven for you today? Interventions are incredibly necessary, they are effective, they are only effective when they're done on a mass scale imposed by the state. These interventions save lives, they help the economy recover quicker, and this reduces inequality in the way that it is implemented. For all of these reasons, so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that nice speech. And now I'd like to invite Deputy Prime Minister.
Sweden is a lovely country, but I can assure you the people of Sweden are not cut from a finer cloth than the people of the other countries of the world. Most people care about those around them and care about their own health and safety. Most people are capable of listening to medical advice and making informed decisions about what will keep them safe, what will keep their friends and family, children and loved ones safe. And most people are capable of considering their own circumstances and engaging in trade-offs between their economic necessity, their health, economic concerns and health concerns. Which is why it is very likely that a counterfactual that notably requires less state capacity than locking people up and enforcing it, that requires less money than massively subsidizing and inflating the economy, that requires the state to do far less, is the likely counterfactual. Beyond the fact that empirically it happened in many countries. I think that precisely explains why this is what we are likely to see. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is explain why fewer people will die on our side than occurred in the status quo, which will take opening opposition out. I will then whip the myriad arguments that Jack gives that receive very flippant response and will win us the debate. Let's start with safety. Let's start with vaccines, which probably made the biggest difference to saving lives in the status quo. they are likely to be funded either way for a number of reasons. Firstly, pharmaceutical firms obviously have a massive profit incentive to spend as much money as possible to come up with the vaccine that is likely to stop the biggest plague of our time. Secondly, most governments believe that vaccines were an effective solution to the problem and would likely believe so anyway. It is not a particularly, intrusive for example, intervention. And the amount spent on vaccines was incredibly cheap compared to all the other costs of COVID. So it'd be massively cost effective to fund those vaccines anyway. And there are massive political incentives. They say, well, the government needs to show that it's doing something. So if they're not doing the things that they suggest that the government uses to, for example, suggest that things are under control, they'd probably do something else, like funding vaccines more aggressively on our side. Their interventions substitute for vaccines. They can say we're doing lockdowns, so vaccines aren't as urgent. On our side, they're far more urgent and far more likely to be done. But importantly, there's more trust in the government when they aren't, for example, lying to people about, for example, masks don't work, but then they do work, but then they don't work, and mandating things, but then saying actually don't wear them. On our side, people are more likely to trust the vaccines when they're not mandated, and therefore there's likely to be more public support for funding of vaccines. That is far better. Secondly, uptake will be higher. That is because, one, prior to COVID, the vast majority of people around the world believed in vaccines and trusted vaccines. They wanted to protect themselves. They don't want to get sick. They want to protect the people around them. They want herd immunity. They want to keep people safe. They would take the vaccine. The mandate is what caused people to backlash against vaccines. They said, if it's so good and so effective, why are you forcing me to take it? Why do I not have choice? And they made analogies to things like abortion. My body, my choice. How come in some circumstances, the liberals say that, you should get to pick what happens to your body, and in other circumstances, they don't. That doesn't happen on our side, which means that it's far more likely that people engage with the vaccines than they otherwise would. And that is crucially important, because beyond the impact on COVID and people's take-up of vaccines, empirically in the status quo, far fewer people take many, many other vaccines that mean far more communicable diseases are on the rise. And for example, I very much doubt RFK Jr. would be the health secretary right now if he had not been able to ride a wave of anti-vaccine sentiment that is directly traceable to the policies that this team supports. So things are much worse there. Secondly, they say you need government intervention because evil bosses will force you into the COVID mines and work without protection. One, I think most people do not want their employees to die. They work with those people every day. They believe that those people's lives matter. They have friends. They hang out with them outside of work. Secondly, I don't think people are as profit motivated as this team suggests. Thirdly, I think the government is likely to provide some form of assistance to allow these people to, for example, not engage in the most dangerous forms of work, provide them with personal protective equipment. This stuff is very cheap. It's clearly good for the economy. It's clearly good for the health of workers. The incentives of the government are clearly aligned here. And finally, in the worst case, you can quit that terrible job and be in just as bad a position as you would be on their side, where you just get fired because you aren't allowed to engage in that work because it requires in-person interaction. For example, if you work at a restaurant, you just get fired on our side, on their side. On our side, you can choose whether you want to work there or whether you want to quit because you believe it's too dangerous. Obviously, some level of state welfare would exist on either side. We just have to spend far less because we don't shut down the economy. So that thing is likely to occur anyway. They say people don't want to do tests, so you have to force them. Like, one, most people do want to know if they have COVID because they don't want to get the people around them who they love sick. But secondly, it's not like the government came to your house and made you take the test. You had to take the test. You could lie about taking the test. You could fake the test. You could actually not stick it up your nose. You could stick it up someone else's nose. The idea that it's not possible to fake the test is ludicrous. Finally, they say you need to be seen to do something, otherwise people will panic. No, we would explain to people honestly what is going on. The cause of panic and distrust was that public health authorities engaged in noble lies because they thought, as this opening opposition team does, that people are stupid and don't deserve to know the truth. They lied about masks working because they didn't want you to purchase them so they could be saved for health workers. We would not engage in that. They lied about whether or not the vaccine would provide sterilizing immunity because they wanted people to take it. We would not do that. We would be truthful. People, when you are honest and frank with them, tend to make reasonable decisions. We think they would do so on our side. And we think, importantly, they would engage in voluntary behaviors that would blunt the worst impacts of the pandemic. People don't want to get sick, and they don't want the people around them to be in trouble, so they will do things like wear personal protective equipment. They'll do things like conduct activities outside rather than inside, get air filters, socially distance. These things aren't particularly hard. People are likely to do them. The most vulnerable have a huge amount of votes. They could obviously, as we point out in a model, there are many incentives why those people would be catered to. You could give them delivery services. You could give them some stimulus. That seems incredibly easy. The last thing I want to note is empirically, we know that some countries had harsher lockdowns and some had less harsh lockdowns, but in the rinse, at the end, the death total was relatively similar across those countries. China had one of the harshest lockdowns. It had lower deaths in the start, but when it was forced to open up, it had far more deaths than any other country because people had not, for example, gotten vaccinated in the numbers they would have otherwise because the COVID ripped through them, the Omega variant, in a way that otherwise would not have been the case. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a good question. I suspect that the reasons governments did that is the reasons pointed to by opening opposition. They wanted to be seen to do something. If your argument is going to be, well, because they need to be seen to do something, they would do something stupider and worse, the reason we give preemptively to why that is not the case is, one, empirically, most governments were faced with that choice, and some decided to do those things, some decided not to, so it seems like the most likely counterfactual is what other governments like Sweden did. But secondly, we think there are other ways you can reassure the public. Like, you can just be honest with them and say, like, we don't think it makes sense to do more than this. Here is why we think it doesn't make sense to do more than this. This is what we generally think is in your best interest there. I think that would work. So, in many instances, they have to open up lockdowns anyway, and more people die. So I think we just win on the issue of safety. But finally, weigh it up. Most of the people who died during COVID were old and would have died in a few years anyway. That is not to say that their deaths were in any way not a tragedy, but you must weigh it against all the other harms in the debate and the massive quantities of immiseration of billions of people who were locked in their homes for 2 years, who did not see loved ones, who did not get to go to school, who had learning loss that cannot just be caught up for, and empirically is not, that cause political harms, that mean people no longer trust elites, not just in the instance of medical advice, that a wave of inflation, that people precisely credited with voting Biden out of office. For all those reasons, incredibly proud to govern.
Now to close the top half of this debate, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Okay. Is this a good volume for everybody? Okay. OG is living in a fucking fantasy world. COVID-19 was one of the worst pandemics that has ever occurred. It was going to ravage the world unless we did something about it. Their response cannot be an assertion that the average person is smart and reasonable and cares a lot about other people and will do good things absent this forcing. And to then suggest that these same people who are so well-intentioned, when forced to do something, would not do the thing, is a ridiculous conception of how people behave. Firstly, why were these lockdowns implemented well? One, on the capacity of governments. Firstly, part of the extreme measures was the immense collection of data. And sure, you can lie about the data, about the tests, but there are A, ways to check when you go into the hospital. They can stick it up your nose. You don't have to do it yourself. But two, there is modeling capacity that exists. It is possible to take in the vast amounts of data that are accrued and make predictions about how different things will work out. Those predictions will not always be perfect. It is true that initially we thought hand washing was the most important thing, and then later we realized that masks were the most important thing. But that brings me to the third thing. We do, even on our side, have the capacity to change orders when information changes. Just because the measures are drastic does not mean they have to be permanent and irrevocable from the moment they are put in. Notably, all of these things come from the immense wealth of technocrats in the nations that we are discussing, and also from their capacity to hire from, for example, universities. Tons and tons of academic research was published during COVID about the different provisions that you might implement and the ways in which this was most likely to cut off deaths. Importantly, the incentives of states is to make the best trade-offs to the average person. This is true in all of the states that we are discussing. They do not, in general, have the incentive to just lock everybody down, fuck the economy for absolutely no reason. They're doing a cost-benefit risk analysis, which we would posit was made reasonably well, absent some better proof from their side. Why does it not work on their side? Firstly, disinformation is a very big problem. Even if you believe that people are well-intentioned, it is not clear that they have the information required to make good and reasonable decisions. This is one, because real good information is hard to understand in a way that lies are not. Second, the specificity of provisions enabled suggested by opening government is vastly harder for any state in the world. Sweden maybe could get away with it, but all of the other states we're also talking about struggle. What are those provisions that they talk about? For example, they talk about specific services to the elderly and the immunocompromised. But I would note, on a sort of trivial note, despite the immense capacity of states, the seeking out of these people and the giving to them of stimulus checks that are proportional to what they ought to be doing in recompense for the work that they may or may not be doing, depending on how other private actors introduce, is not clearly something that they are able to do well or will do strategically, not right now. Secondly, they talk about this concept of subsidizing work from home, and they're like, we'll just subsidize work from home. I don't really know what that means, and then the private industry will just solve for where that happens. I don't really know why that's true. Why is it that governments would be able to pick which firms and which industries can work from home? It is vastly preferable to have a wide swath of stimulus given out to everybody. This is one, because it will be inflationary symmetrically if they're proposing a whole bunch of stimulus into things like work from home procedures, but without leading to the worst harms, which tend to be the inequality that people suffer. It's okay to be inflationary if everybody is $1,000 richer. It's much worse to be inflationary if half the people are $2,000 richer. I'll get to the political impacts in a second. Now, let's talk the last thing I want to point out is you are able to plan for the response. If you decide on a drastic and strict lockdown, you can plan for how that will go in a way that you cannot if you are trusting the private market to resolve itself by just telling people to do things and not being totally sure the ways that they will react. Back half.
Yeah, I loved my time during lockdown because I was going to parties, making out with girls, drinking together, and otherwise not following the instructions set on me by government. Well, I think is the likely version of how these things look like.
I'm glad you guys are clapping for that insane self-report. I'm glad you're having a lot of fun. Why is the average person not as bold as CG? Because, firstly, for the reasons illustrated by opening government, lots and lots of people are well-intentioned, but absent good information and absent some strong, compelling force to act against their immediate self-interest, they are not going to do the things required for the benefit of them and for their well-being. Secondly, in many states, there were measures put in place to enforce this sort of behavior. It was true that if I was out walking, a policeman could stop me and ask me who I was with, why I was out and about. That is a fine thing that we are willing to accept on our side of the house to explain why this is true. The last thing I want to explain is why people are irrational. The reasons you should believe that people are irrational and the profit motive isn't good is that we have a whole bunch of labor protection laws, and the average debater, who's probably smarter than the average person, smokes. Obviously bad for you, obviously bad for your kids, obviously bad for the people around you. It's just not clear that the average person is behaving super rationally. So, with those two important pieces of characterization out of the way, let's talk super quickly about a bunch of random impacts that are dropped from PM. Firstly, on education. Deeply unclear to me what the end impact is. Oh no, test scores fell. Is the GDP of every country in the entire world going to fall 2% in the next year? Let's think with our brains about how likely that is. Obviously, it's not going to happen. Secondly, if they want people to be wearing masks, but wearing masks is bad, it's probably worse when people are wearing masks for a lot longer. The reason they're wearing masks for a lot longer is because when you're unable to slow the spread of COVID-19, then you are unable to ever stop it. The way that you stop the pandemic is by bringing its R rate or its replacement rate below the level that is sustainable in a population. That is only achievable when you have a prolonged delay and stop in the amount of contagion that is happening. That is why the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to be much shorter on our side of the house, and so silly things like masks are symmetrical. Let's talk super quickly about politics. Firstly, let's just weigh this out super quickly. The weighing that I want you to do, and actually I'll just do general weighing right now. The death of a loved one, vastly more important, vastly worse for you than playing Trackmania at school. In particular, I think they're doing okay. It's not clear to me that playing Trackmania was that bad for this team. Secondly, workers being in and out of work unreliably for years is much worse than a couple of years of planned shocks. Again, this is where the government's capacity to know that a shock is coming because of its own capacity to initiate that shock is important. And thirdly, most importantly, you dying is obviously worse than experiencing a riot or having some amount of polarization. On polarization, it's deeply unclear to me that this wouldn't have happened symmetrically. There were lots and lots and lots of reasons that Trump came into power and then that Trump appointed RFK. It's not clear to me that this is the tipping point. Notably, if inflation would have still happened, and that's the main mechanism that they're pointing to, great. Lastly, there's a burden for them to explain why Trump is that bad, but they can have fun with that on back half. Vaccines. I don't really know what the point of the POI was. I hope Matt Cato isn't desperately ill right now, wishing him the best. Why did they need to be mandated? One, people are deeply irrational with vaccines because they hurt and they're scary. Simple reason why people would not do them unless they were mandated. Secondly, because of the misinformation that we pointed out earlier. So, what we need to do is force people to take the vaccine because it is good for them. They're vastly less likely to die, even if they might not know it. And it's vastly better for the people around them because it was proven to reduce the rates of contagion. So proud.
seconds from the speech that you have afterwards, please don't do that. Thank you. It's okay, I appreciate it.
Okay, everybody ready? In Bulgaria, we closed off the whole country because of 2 COVID cases. 6 million people, 2 COVID cases. I shit you not. Why? Because of EU pressure that wanted us to close down, because our prime minister wanted to steal a bunch of fucking money to inflate the fucking budget and do all of this. Most of the world, COVID wasn't actually that big of a real issue, and I am sick and tired of this Western perspective that the government is always good and the government is always doing what is right for people. First thing that I'm going to prove, lockdown wasn't effective in limiting COVID, just straight up. 1, people did not follow it. People did not follow it because they didn't believe that they need to follow it in the particular ways that the government was telling them. They didn't believe that a mask is going to solve their issue. And I don't blame them. If the government is telling you there is very deadly contagious virus that is going to kill you, obviously you won't believe that a mask will save your life. And note that this also intertwined with masks being very uncomfortable. And people tend to be short-termistic, right? They tend to be biased around themselves. They believe that they are not going to be the ones that are going to be killed. Is COVID actually that big of an issue? And this is why they chose to take off their masks and not be always washing their hands, because that took time of them. But also secondly, note that the government was incredibly ineffective in policing this all across the world. There were so many private parties that the Prime Minister of the UK was holding most of them. There was so much enforcement that the enforcers themselves did not believe in this. The police themselves, the policemen who are supposed to be policing all of the parks and policing all of the buildings where the people are going in and out, they themselves did not believe, or they thought they were at a real threat of, getting the virus, and this is why they didn't proceed to do so. But note that we know empirically that the disease was absolutely fucking everywhere. It was in the air, it was in the water, and it stayed on surfaces for multiple hours. So if somebody touched it and you touched it again, then it's going to probably be in you. So it was highly contagious. So even very small interactions led to everybody being fucking sick. If you poll Bulgarians, everybody has herd immunity. Even though we had a lockdown for 2 fucking years, it is because of those small interactions that happened that are inevitable that everybody got sick. Even in the best state policing in China, where there were cameras everybody, there were checkpoints everywhere, everybody was sick. But also thirdly, there was a psychological effect to people that got worse with time, because although there was state enforcement, they wanted to rebel. Bro, if you're locked in a fucking room with all of your family, you would want to go out, you would want to have a party, you would want to have these rebellions. They went on as many dog walks they could. They bought more dogs so that they have a justification for going out to the park, for fuck's sake. And the more you stayed inside, the more you wanted to rebel, the worse it got over time. The bottom line here is, if you look at most countries and with most lockdowns, everybody has herd immunity. Literally, vaccine, no vaccine, I don't care. Know that OG says, oh, people trust medicine, the government. Why is this much better than what OG is saying? Because our psychological analysis does not only apply to the West, where people are educated and they trust the government and the government is gay. It applies to every fucking country in the world that had a lockdown. But now let's talk about the crisis COVID actually led to, where in the majority of the world, note the developing world, there was not so much of an epidemic, but this led to mass economic harms. Firstly, the COVID pandemic wasn't as prominent in the developing world. Why? 3 reasons for this. The first one is the developing world is not as internationalized as is the West. Not so many flights went back and forth in the developing world, and not so much of the disease was spread, and specifically not the variants that were harder to deal with immunity. Why it was so bad in the West? Because of this constant movement that was happening that we couldn't close off. Secondly, the economic activity in the developing world is already lower, so there isn't so much movement internally within the country compared to the West. But also, thirdly, just genetic differences that occur in different regions. Know that the immune system of very many communities within the developing world is much stronger because they also face so many other different outbreaks and epidemics that they have. Know that this also means that practically they have know-how how to deal with epidemic prevention. But also, thirdly, like fourthly, herd immunity just happened. I haven't heard one reason as to why herd immunity was not as effective as the vaccine. Now, secondly, they still closed off their economies. Why? The government wanted to take proactive actions. 3 reasons for this. One, they were pressured by the West. They literally were at the threat of sanctions, very many countries. Why? Because A, the West is incredibly risk averse in this. They didn't want to take a chance to spread the virus faster. But also secondly, it was us versus them. The US literally just wanted to place sanctions on China and to blame them for the spreading of the virus. They wanted to create that, oh, we are the legitimate West and not necessarily China and demonize them. But also secondly, this gave them much more power. This gave them much more state overreach because they introduced national emergency, which gave them the capacity to steal even more from the budget, blow the budget even further. But thirdly, they were just malinformed, so they functioned by example. Nobody knew what the fuck is going on back then, and this is why the government continued to do so. Go!
Even if everyone gets sick eventually, if at least some people obey restrictions, the spread slows such that hospitals can accommodate them and save lives.
Bro, literally no. Okay. Now, second reason for this, very quickly, even if the state didn't close, the MNCs within those countries closed themselves because they were pressured by the Western governments that those MNCs came from. If we're looking at Bangladesh garment industry, this is exactly what happened when they laid off their workers. Thirdly, this created massive long-term crisis in the developing world that trickled down to the developed world and was completely needless. And why this win is because OG falls into the trap comparison. Oh, there are some harms compared to all the deaths, but there were not much more deaths on our side of the house because it was not actually fucking needed for most of the world. What was the harm? Firstly, blue-collar workers were suspended without pay. There was no work from home for them, for all of the garment industry workers. Secondly, the government support was so fucking limited within the developing world. Just because A, normal capacity the developing world has for offer, but also B, because its capacity in times of crisis, they prioritize their elites and their friends due to cronyism. But also thirdly, the West used this as a justification to fuck over the developing world. The West just wanted to move away from China anyways, so they placed massive tariffs on China anyways, so that they move away from them. Those are people that cannot fucking recover. Bangladesh is still facing 20 to 30% unemployment in the garment industry. Nepal is facing 20 to 30 fucking percent unemployment. Note, the prices went up. This is a perfect crisis leading to the death of literally millions in the long term. Vote us.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Opening government is correct that the most important change in this debate is how people interact with each other and how they interact with their governments. The problem is that both of those things would have been far worse if you did not lock down in an extraordinarily strong way immediately. Our first contribution is going to explain why there's generally more competition between people and why everyone becomes less trustful of each other in a world where you do not have extreme lockdowns. I would note that opening opposition's criticism of opening government's counterprop of the Sweden model is like, well, not all countries have the level of trust in medicine medicine and the government that Sweden has. Clearly, if that criticism is true, that would be at tension with their own analysis about why people followed lockdowns and trusted lockdowns, so they undermine their own analysis. Our criticism will be that the reason that you can't do the Sweden model is just because you can't afford it. And I would note that opening opposition suggests that things like working from home are expensive. Like, that is not the problem. The problem is that things like masks are expensive. And we will make the positive claim that when you don't have large amounts of lockdown, the counterfactual is massive competition over the resources that people think are necessary to survive. First of all, there's a massive competition in the form of the amount of money and each dollar that you are able to invest. Like, it is true that it is rich people that can take time off work, but I think it's more true that it's, for example, rich countries are likely to develop monopolies over access to masks or other medicines which are seen as useful for resilience to COVID. It's far more likely to resilience to COVID. And all of opening government's analysis about stimulus is far less bad than competition over resources, for the reason that at least stimulus goes back into the economy and can be used to grow the economy, kind of benefit anyway. Clearly, if people are just spending massive amounts of money on things like masks, that is an ineffective use of resources when you could just be locked down instead. That explains why, in general, the rich are likely to be far off, which is a worse form of inequality. But additionally, it explains why there is a massive amount of competition between countries. And that leads to the second part of this claim, which is to explain that because all of opening government's counterfactuals are likely to be extremely resource intensive, that is the worst outcome for the developing world. And this is going to flip closing government's extension. I would observe that even in the world where where rich countries did have strong lockdowns, which meant, of course, that you needed less masks because you weren't going outside, there was a shortage of masks. That gets far worse when all rich countries are far more likely to have things like people wearing masks all the time, for the reason that you massively increase the demand for things like masks from the countries that can afford it. The problem is, therefore, all of the poorer countries that opening government themselves don't have access to the capacity to do things like lockdown. They relied on things like masks and medicine to deal with the consequences of COVID, just have far less access to it, which just explains why all of these countries that didn't have the capacity to protect themselves through lockdowns end up in a far worse world under side opening government. They're far more likely to have massive increased amounts of COVID, but also there's just generally less likely to be far less trust. And when countries and people are competing over resources that they think is the difference between living or dying, that is when you're far less likely to get cooperation on things like vaccines. That's when you're far less likely to get trust on things like border security to the extent that you need it. All of that is far worse. And that explains is far worse. But second of all, people are likely to fear each other far worse. We would suggest that while opening opposition is correct, that for the most part, people might be too confident and might go outside a lot during COVID, there are plausibly also a group of people that would be extremely paranoid. Those who, for instance, are very fearful of disease and are prone to those kind of views. Or, for instance, people that just look at the data and look how deadly COVID is and want to make sure they protect each other and would have the capacity to do so. This is probably people who are rich, but additionally, people who are in government. We would suggest that these people are likely to do things like self-isolate aggressively. They're likely to move to communities where they're not exposed to COVID. They're likely to do things like wear masks around and take extremely obvious steps which would suggest that they are fearful of COVID. What is the harm of this response? First of all, we would point out that regardless of who is protecting themselves from COVID, everyone starts to see each other as a risk. At least when you are locked down, there is no fear that your neighbor might be the person that transmits to you the disease that kills you. When you are out in the way that opening government wants to, there is a massive fear of every single person you see that just massively increases the hate and distrust. And that is likely to be a lingering fear. That is not a fear that you can get over quickly, and that is incredibly bad for society in the long run. But second of all, this kind of split of community flips both governments' teams on crises. Yes, it was bad when you had Partygate and people saw the government going out. I would suggest it is worse when the government says things like, no, you don't have to lock down, but every single person in government is locking down. They're pulling their kids out of school because they're fearful of getting the diseases. They are taking all the precautions to make sure that they're safe. When there is a misalignment between the amount that people are protecting themselves, with the elites doing far more protection and everyone else doing far less protection, that is likely to lead to far more distrust because you feel as if the government is not looking after you. The third contribution is on fear of the government. Before I do that, Uday.
Yeah, PPE like masks are simply designed with a cheap input cost, which is why the shortages were short-lived. Companies and governments immediately spun up production lines and get crap tons of stuff within 3 months of the pandemic.
Right, but if it's all the rich countries that need it, they spin up production for themselves. All of my analysis about why there's global competition for resources explains why that mechanism doesn't work. I also just think it's empirically untrue that this was a shortage that was fixed in such a short time. Why is there more fear of government? I would note that opening government suggests we would just be honest and tell people how bad COVID is. I think the opposite is true for a few reasons. First of all, we would suggest that the government on their side clearly has to justify why they're letting people go outside, insofar as people are probably still dying from COVID. That means that they're likely to downplay the severity of COVID, they're likely to make it seem less bad, which is not only an essential mechanism for people taking more risk that opening opposition doesn't take, but is also a reason why people are likely to trust the government less. Because while the government is doing all this messaging and saying like, no, it's fine, you should be participating in the economy in the way the opening government says, people are still likely to be seeing World Health Organization numbers, people are still likely to be seeing all of the experts that regardless of what governments did, were calling for extreme lockdowns. And that leads to a massive amount of mistrust in the ability of governments to manage things. But second of all, we would point out that all of the private industries that both government teams suggest people can opt into are likely to capitalize on this. They're likely to call the government incompetent. All of my previous analysis about why a series of people are still going to seek protection from COVID explains why there's likely to be a massive private lobby that is likely to paint the government as incompetent in a way they could never do when the government enforced lockdown. The biggest impact of all of this analysis, though, comes in the future. We would point out COVID was a terrible pandemic, but things are likely to get worse. Pandemics are likely to become far more common into the future for three key reasons. First of all, increased microbial resistance just means we have far more diseases that we can't cure. Second, urbanization accelerates the passing of diseases and means that you have far matching of diseases. But third of all, climate change means that generally people have worse nutrition, they get sicker better, but also things like melting of the permafrost exposes the amount of bacteria that you have in the world. The problem is that on-site opening government, if you didn't lock down now, when you had worse pandemics into the future, the capacity for government to do necessary lockdowns was massively reduced. Because people would point at COVID in the way this government bench does and say, it was fine, we didn't need to lock down, we could just ride it out. They would say COVID was not that bad. The fact that we got lucky and made a vaccine in 1 year would be a reason that people would be insufficiently fearful of vaccines in the future. So every single time that there would be another disease in the future, many, many more people will die, which is a far bigger harm than opening opposition. So proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the government side of the debate, I'd like to invite the government whip.
Dozy? Dozy. Okay. Oh, okay.
Bro, what is this Australian bullshit where they run 5 random one-line arguments in extension instead of just making one fucking argument in this particular regard? Firstly, response to the 17 things coming out of closing opposition that all receive one singular line of analysis. The first thing is, Western countries will stockpile comparatively more on masks. The first is, this seems like it would be true whether we have a lockdown or not, because masks had to be worn even during lockdown at any point where you had to leave and get out, so at any point this is likely to be comparatively true. Note that the West is also more risky when thinking about these things, because the skepticism about COVID is higher in the developed world in this particular capacity. Also, secondly, we can make more masks, we can do these kinds of particular things. Secondly, they say, people now see each other as enemies and they hate each other in this kind of sense. The first is, this seems like it would be way worse if there was a lockdown, where you see people who disobey the lockdown, where you see people who don't do these kinds of particular things, where there's mass hysteria everywhere and the government telling you everything might go to shit in this particular capacity. Also, secondly, what's this impact, bro? Who gives a shit? Fuck off. I see my neighbor could fuck my wife tomorrow and I could hate him for that too. There are 10 billion reasons why we could see each other in any kind of way. This doesn't seem like a tangible thing I ought to give a shit about when we're talking about death and economic destruction in this particular capacity. Thirdly, they say there is distrust in the government. Some people will distrust the government for doing lockdown. Some people will distrust the government for not doing lockdown in this particular case. Total deadlock. How do we adjudicate this? Because we tell you, the people who would hate you for a lockdown are more. Most people are short-termist. Most people are optimism biased. Most people are fed into misinformation. Do you know which team gave it? This analysis is the one that clapped opening opposition. That's why most of these people will distrust this particular capacity. But at best, I don't understand what is an important impact. Finally, they say, this helps us against future pandemics because it gives us know-how. I don't know how likely a future pandemic is, Pandemics often have a very large gap between occurring. The last one was the Spanish flu 100 fucking years ago, and I'd wager by the time the next one comes around, we'll have forgotten what we've done. But also it's possible if we hate the lockdown, we're just lighter than we should be comparatively protecting us. But also this is a highly speculative impact. Firstly, what are the responses we receive in POIs or otherwise? The first response we receive is the government has measures to make people follow it so it will be effective. 3 responses to this. The first is, note what a high burden this is. Because for lockdown to be effective, you have to track everything. How do you know if someone is going in their own apartment or in someone else's apartment? How do you know if they're going somewhere or not going somewhere in this particular case? The burden is often massive, and factually, it was extremely difficult to follow. Also, secondly, many governments are bad as fuck, bro. The Bulgarian policeman is a fat, incompetent guy who doesn't care about his job in this particular case. Sorry to Bulgarian policemen. Like, many of these people are not massively motivated to do this. You often don't have the data. Like, many governments don't have data on what particularly is going on in this kind of sense. But thirdly, okay, you track everything. What are you gonna do? Are you gonna put 100,000 people in prison? Are you gonna put 10,000 people who disobey this in jail at a time of economic crisis? No, there's very little you can do. You can often find these people small time, but they'll tank the fine in exchange for going to drink because they've been stuck in a fucking house for so long. Also, secondly, they say, people are not bad, right? People broadly care kind of about this kind of thing. Firstly, opening opposition verbatim says, there's mass misinformation, many people are short-termist and optimism biased, and for many people, they don't believe that they have COVID when they get sick. So they don't believe that this is the thing that is happening to them when this occurs. So no, people will follow their own selfish desires. They'll feel a little bit of a cold and they'll go, it's not COVID, it's something else. They'll go outside in this particular capacity. Their own analysis explains this in this kind of sense. But also secondly, and this is a beautiful way we do this, let's say only some of our people are dumbasses. Although in Bulgaria, majority were. The very important thing is to stop the spread. You only need a few very dumb people. Even if only 10% of the population are dumb, these people can infect everyone else. Why? Because you're always forced to interact with people. In the store, in this kind of place, in that other kind of place, in the outside on the street, in this particular capacity. So if these people walk around with no masks, they can interact with you in this kind of sense. That's where Velina says this is massively contagious. So even if it's a small number of people, it massively matters. And finally, they say it's okay so long as it is slower in this kind of sense. The first is, if this costs a massive amount of money, particularly when done by corrupt states, then we can allocate this money alternatively to things like hospitals, to things like being able to deal with this better comparatively. But also secondly, know that this actually makes it worse when you have the coronavirus, when you have lockdowns and people don't follow it. Why? Because then the overwhelming of the hospitals is a black swan event. You didn't expect this to happen. You aren't as prepared to happen. It is more intuitive that hospitals will be overwhelmed if this happens, so you as the state can take better precaution against this, but you can't when you do this. But also thirdly, many people, when there is a lockdown, are sent to the hospital even when they have light symptoms. Why? Because the state has to justify what they've done, so they make everyone report themselves as being fucking COVID and go to a hospital quickly.
If people don't obey the restrictions, then why were the restrictions bad? The stronger your case, the smaller
Yeah,
the margin.
perfect. Why are the restrictions still terrible even if people don't obey them? Because the restrictions are still effective in the official stuff, in closing down work, in closing down schools. But it doesn't matter if you get infected at school or when interacting with a friend, you get infected all the same. So all the economic benefits of this still occur, but the health benefits do not at a point where people still interact with others. These are first points of way. Like, I'm unclear. Okay, maybe people die in some places. Maybe some people maybe some people have terrible economic conditions. We tell you, people die and they have terrible economic conditions, allowing for a very simple way to end. But also secondly, like, it's at best uncertain what's better in this situation. It's better to save people, it's better to have economic conditions. We tell you, there are situations where people wouldn't have died otherwise, where COVID wouldn't have been as serious, where there wouldn't have been as much of a compromise of the supply chain, as much of a compromise of the immune. In those cases, this was unambiguously bad in this kind of sense. But even if you don't buy this, the countries we talk about are the most important, because they say, kids don't don't learn because they learn online and online work is inefficient. There is no online work in the developing world. There are no computers in schools to put that shit online. The impact is so vastly exacerbated to the point where starvation and other disease is a bigger fear than COVID. Vote us!
Yeah, of course. Sorry. Firstly, on health, I'll explain why closing opposition is the team that proves more people die. Opening government have their counterfactual as the Swedish model. Opening opposition say people don't trust the government elsewhere as much as in Sweden. We say people don't have as much money as the Swedes do, as the Swedish government does, and that's the most important mechanism in the debate. The second most important mechanism is when everything depends on that government spending, when everything depends on vaccines, on masks, on ventilators, on paying enough staff to fill up the hospitals, the price and the competition for all of those goods and services increases massively. Developing countries that did lock down in the status quo, countries like Brazil or like India, like Bangladesh, when they no longer lock down, can't access those things. They have experienced brain drain because it's more cost effective for the workers and nurses and doctors to go overseas. They just don't have enough ventilators. They don't have enough vaccines. Guys, it's not just about masks, it's all the other things, but also clearly we did have a shortage of masks. Clearly your claim that we can make more masks is an uncomparative one. They are less accessible under your side. Which also explains, or things like with vaccines. Lockdown allowed a progressive rollout of vaccines, right? At the start, there was a very limited supply and we were able to give it to the people who needed it most. The elderly, the immunocompromised. When you don't lock down, everyone wants it at once because everyone is scared. Everyone thinks I'm going to school, I'm going to work, I need a vaccine now, which is why the prices skyrocket. And the poorer governments of the world just can't afford this. Let's weigh this extension. Firstly, this is clearly better proof of people dying than opening opposition because OG does do really well with the Swedish model stuff and mitigating health, which means at the end of the opening half, the number of people dying is ambiguous. But at the end of closing opposition, you know that billions of more people in the developing world are exposed to a serious risk of death. Millions of more people will die. All of opening opposition's weighing applies here, but we've proven the impact far better. But secondly, that's the context where COVID is the worst. That's the context where hygiene is the worst, where there are the fewest hospitals, the fewest staff, where there is the most informal housing, which allows the disease to spread quickly. Closing our government are they have a less developed economy, so there's less interaction. No, clearly that means there's more interaction, because you need to go to the shops to buy things. You're not accessing things on services. There are less delivery drivers. Things like air pollution, compound respiratory illnesses. Clearly, that is the context that's most important in the debate, and that's the context where we prove that the most people are dying. We've won. Next claim here is about precedent. When COVID happened, we did look to the Spanish flu as an example. People used it to guide them. People used it as to say, look how many people died then. Look at how serious this issue is. They pointed to the quarantines that were effective then. People looked to SARS because in times of crisis, we look to the past. We explain at some point there will be another pandemic. And even if you believe it's only in the next 20 years or once every 20 years for the next century, which is reasonably likely given all the mechanisms we give you, microbial resistance is massively on the rise. It's seriously one of the most existential threats. The last time we invented an antibiotic was in 2001. Population growth, especially in poorer countries like Nigeria or like India or like Bangladesh, where populations in urban centers are going to explode, means there's likely to be more transition of disease. Things like climate change means there'll be less clean drinking water to go around, which means it's more likely that people acquire diseases that way. There's a risk of things like biological warfare. We don't have to prove this happens very often. We just have to prove it happens, say, once or twice in the next 50 years. And in that time, it will be worse. And in that context, we will need to lock down. And if this government bench is right, and the lockdowns, and we didn't lock down and it would have been fine, then people will have a false sense of confidence, then we won't lock down enough, and then more people will die. Once again, closing opposition is the team that has proven the biggest number of people dying in this debate. That's clearly the most important question, and clearly we're winning on this. The next question I want to talk about is chaos and division. Closing government are like, oh, what's the harm? Firstly,
there is a serious economic impact because post-COVID, once we had lockdowns, people were able to go back to work, go back to shops, go back to theaters immediately because they trusted each other, because they trusted the data, they trusted and they knew, in fact, that everyone else was vaccinated because you had to prove it. You had to get, like, in many countries, a certificate to show it. You couldn't enter into a shop without showing that certificate in many contexts. So people were confident to go back and do their daily life. The problem is when you don't force people to do that sort of stuff and people don't believe that everyone else is protecting themselves, no one ever feels confident to go back out. People who are immunocompromised, people who might live with their grandma, they never go back. Their economic activity doesn't start again. And that proves the biggest economic impact and I think flips a lot of opening government's economic impact because that's when the longest period of low demand for consumer goods, of businesses not being able to open, of people not being able to go to work happens. You need confidence after the pandemic that everything is okay before the economy can get started again. Secondly, the impact of the chaos and division is general anti-establishmentarianism. Things like the rise of extremist rhetoric. We say it's unlikely to trust the government, and indeed, the government has a much bigger incentive to lie about the numbers underside government, to prevent all of the panic that is occurring, to rebut the doctors and the WHO when they say you need to lock down. And that leads to things like the rise of extremist ideals. It leads to things like the rise of anti-vaccines and extremist political parties that hurt and destroy our political system. But finally, socially, thirdly, it leads to a huge amount of things like racism. Think about the amount of xenophobia that existed in the status quo that gets a billion times worse when you think it's China that is, just killing all of your family. But also, when you don't close your borders, think about the anti-immigration rhetoric that starts up because you say those people are bringing COVID into our country. That is what destroys people's lives. It's what tears community apart. And on the social and psychological metric is clearly also the most important contribution, which is why CO is doing very well on that clash. Yeah.
Lockdowns didn't end because we solved COVID. They were abandoned due to mass backlash, causing Omicron to run rampant through the population, killing far more people than if we'd never locked down. Discrediting governments on public health issues, like your future pandemics, like other vaccines, like all of those things.
They ended once everyone had gotten vaccinated, man. The immediate time that you went back after COVID, you mostly had to show proof of your vaccination to go anywhere. That's also the only time that people felt confident to go out, especially if you were old, especially if you were immunocompromised. Lockdown ended when people felt safe. Next, rebuttal to closing government. Clearly, they're knifing their opening because, the whole thing about people don't do the procedures fucks all of OG's harms. But clearly, some other responses. I think already preempted it pretty well, and I don't think CG gets over that. But firstly, I think the people who did avoid that and do all the crazy shit that probably is pretty immoral that CG said they did, were the people who could, right? They were the people who were vaccinated, they were the people who were young, they were the people who had good immune systems. My grandma wasn't evading the rules because she was really scared. Secondly, when people did evade the rules, they did it in very smart ways. They went out with their small circles, they probably tested before it, and if they did get sick, they would avoid immunocompromised people in their life. I think that's a silly claim. I'm also not sure where it gets them in the debate. It's really just a big piece of mitigation. Then their final claim is COVID is not bad in the developing world and the lockdowns are worse. I think I've already totally responded to the whole COVID wasn't bad in the developing world thing. Their mechanisms are insane, genetic differences. Bro, what the fuck? COVID killed everyone. Or less economic activity. But the thing is, I rebutted that one already. Here's the thing. The lockdowns, as I've already explained, were better in the economic world. But their mechanisms are silly. They say the state stole all the money from the budget. Our claim is they didn't spend enough money in the first place and they couldn't spend that money underside government bench. Also, opening government says you increase the spending a lot. And then they say it hurts the economy, but the economic analysis I already gave you about trust and confidence explains in that context as well why closing opposition are the team that has won the debate.